Great to see everyone here today, and thanks to Martyn. So Martyn is an ex-president of Chamber, and we're very pleased to welcome him here today for this talk, and he's presenting on the cost of living crisis. I think we may have a bit of a clash with a certain football match today, but obviously we don't care about that. Thanks for coming along. So Martyn is founder and managing director of Dorey Financial Modelling, a business whose mission is to transform uncertainty into better decisions. So the topic of what can Guernsey expect to happen in the next few years and how can we prepare is obviously perfect for you, Martyn. So I'm absolutely expecting a stimulating conversation today and to see how Guernsey can make the necessary preparations to combat a potentially turbulent few years to come. But I think the best introduction is what Martyn wrote on Twitter, which was, "No smelling salts will be required." So, over to you.
Firstly, thank you, Diane. It's nice to be introduced as an ex-president. For anyone who's seen Point Break, this sort of gang of criminals known as the ex-presidents was always something I aspired to. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Matthew Argwala, who's very kindly come over to Guernsey just to be sort of join us for this event. Matthew's actually one of the UK's top in environmental economists. He's a fellow at Cambridge University, did I get that right? And also, what's your position at Yale? I can't remember. Senior policy fellow at Yale. And I thought I'd sort of, whatever I say over the course of half an hour will be almost certainly trumped by 1 minute of Matthew Argwala. So I thought I might ask Matthew at the end just to give the audience a little bit of feedback about what he's seen and heard, and if I've made something an absolute boo-boo, please correct me. So today we're talking about the cost of living crisis. I'm going to talk for a little bit over half an hour, and between 1 and 1:15 we'll stop for lunch. You'll see how we've got some icons on the screen, and I'll explain these in a minute. One thing that's absolutely shocked me is just how deep this problem is and how it stretches all the way around the globe, and how our behaviours as humans are coming back to bite us on the butt. And I wasn't expecting any of this when I accepted Diane's invitation to explore this. And Laura, thank you. So the first thing is people feel pain, financial pain. And even before the costs of living crisis, the Office for National Statistics in the UK was picking up some demographic problems in relation to people struggling to get by. And this was before the cost of living crisis and COVID hit. So this little chart here is showing people who report finding it quite or very difficult to get by. And you'll see that the group who finds it most difficult to get by is the 45 to 54 age-old people. Now, these people are supporting their parents, they're supporting their children, they're supporting mortgage costs. They are bearing the entire brunt of society's costs, and they're committing the most to tax revenues to support all of society. And remember, this is before the crisis. And what's happened is, and we're still waiting for all the data to feed through, but what's happened during the course of the cost of living crisis is that actually the older demographic have generally, but not always, but generally got savings in the bank, and they've paid for their mortgages, and they're in a much stronger position to actually weather the storm. But the people who are absolutely in the middle of it, bizarrely, are the middle ages of the population. They're the ones who are feeling the pain. Now, the younger demographic is feeling a slightly different pain in a different area, and I'm going to come to them as we go along. So in Guernsey, we're very lucky because we've got an epic statistics unit. They really are absolutely first class, and they collect data which allows us to see exactly what's going on with very high resolution. And you will see that in Guernsey, this is the thing that's most interesting for us is RPI, which is the green line. And you can see over the course of 2021 from March, RPI has just flown off the chart. In fact, the average Guernsey person at the end of September, and the year's not over yet, would have experienced 8% increase in their cost of living, which is huge, actually. And when we look at the components of it, it actually gets eye-watering. But where people are feeling the pain is essentially broken into food. So about 1.2% of the cost of living that all of us are experiencing is down to food. A similar amount from the cost of fuel. And they say fuel and light, but really it's about fuel. Motoring expenditure is really about the cost of buying a car and maintaining it. And housing. So these are really the most important components. And today I'm going to forget everything else. And I'm just going to look at these key bits at the top. Some of them interact. I'll talk about that in a moment. So how did we get here? What actually kicked it off? We got a really amazing graphic guy who supports us in the business. And Glenn produced this infographic. And the problem today actually really started in the year 1999 to 2000. What happened was there was an extraordinary tech bubble, the dot-com boom, followed by the dot-com bust. And this was unusual because it took 3 years to recover from that. This was the longest period we've seen in history of year-on-year market crashes. We had 3 years of the stock markets going down. And in the UK, we'd never experienced that to that extent. And the UK government and many other governments just said, we need to pump money into the system just to keep the economy alive. And then this led to another crash, which was the financial crash in 2007. There was so much money supporting dodgy mortgages in the US, a wall of money, that we're actually looking at the entire financial collapse of the monetary system. And it was, the scale of it is just totally off the scale. Now governments had another problem. How do we keep the entire global economy on a life support long enough for us to recover from this asset price disaster from the financial crisis? And so what governments have done is that they've really been printing money ever since 2007, 2008. And this has actually led to all sorts of problems. But actually, the economies still haven't properly recovered from the financial crash. And lots of people are experiencing poverty. And one of the problems of poverty and people not having enough cash is you get political polarization. Now, we saw in the UK, there was a move towards Brexit. And we saw in the US, there was a move to Trump politics. That's right. And we've also seen the rise of far-right politics in Europe, something we thought we'd all seen the back of. As part of the Trump thinking, you know, what we're going to do is we're going to have jobs for Americans, and we're going to do real American stuff, and we're not going to rely on the Chinese who are taking all of our jobs and they're producing all of our goods. And in fact, what Trump did is he kicked off the US-China trade war. Now, our worries at the moment are all around, you know, essentially the cost of living, and we put it down to the Ukraine war. But actually, that's not true. It actually started with the kickoff of the US-China trade war. And I'll show you where it's hurting us as we go along. Something amazing happened on the 31st of January, 2020. Not only was there Brexit, but on exactly the same date, the index case of COVID arrived in the north of England. And I think it's extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, that COVID and Brexit happened on exactly the same day, the 31st of January, 2020. Obviously, COVID has affected us, but then we got the war in the Ukraine, and then the most staggering budget I've ever seen in history. And I have to be careful what words I use here, but it's just utter stupidity. The other thing that's happening is demographics. We're running out of people. Everyone may, and I'll show you the vacancies for jobs at the moment in the UK. But it's not just the UK, it's the same in Germany. It's the same in America. It's the same, in many parts of the world, that people are retiring and they're not being replaced. And it's creating a massive jobs shortage. And some of these things aren't going to go away. Unfortunately, Europe population, the working population, is on its way down. We've got this other thing, which is climate change. And I hadn't the foggiest idea just how present climate change is affecting us. And I thought that climate change was something that would happen in the distant future. I didn't think it was actually going to start affecting prices today. And I think it's very interesting. I was lucky enough to speak to a politician called Tim Yeo, who was one of the first Conservative politicians to start dealing with the environment. And he told me at the weekend, he said, do you know, I was Minister for the Environment and I spoke to the scientists about climate change and they didn't want to alarm anyone. They didn't want anyone to panic. So what they said is it's not going to happen straight away. It's going to happen gently and in the course of time. So you don't have to panic about it now, but it's something that's definitely happened and it needs to be on your radar. But the reality is that climate change is happening at the worst end of people's expectations. And it's because our human behavior isn't reacting to it properly. We're not being reactive enough to climate change. And I think that's going to change. And the other thing we're seeing is the loss of the natural world. This again is affecting our entire supply chains because we are, at the end of the day, animals. We rely on the environment to exist. And as soon as we lose the environment, we've lost our food and our air that we breathe. And this is affecting the cost of living today. And I'm going to put some numbers on that for you to see. So America is a big place. Half of the world's stock market pretty much is based in America. And it's a large segment of global trade. Whatever happens in the US will affect us here in the UK. And just going to move on to the next slide. This is looking at US unemployment and interest rates. And I'm going to show you how they combine to create an economic cycle. Now, generally, when unemployment, which is here in gold, is low, lots of people are in work, unemployment is low, and people start competing to get their salaries up. And what happens is start getting inflation. And the Monetary Committee, or the Fed in the US, will be saying, to calm down inflation, we're going to make money more expensive, and we're going to raise interest rates. So calm down, we're going to raise interest rates, and this will hopefully take the heat out of the economy. And I don't know whether you can see, but actually the blue line and the gold line are almost in a wave against each other. They're actually sort of in a cyclical pattern. I'm going to isolate that using a very simple bit of maths. I just put them on the same scale and do one minus the other. And I've got a measure of the economic cycle. And I use this a lot in our work. It's embarrassingly simple. I put interest rates and unemployment on the same scale. I take one away from the other. Now, when this economic cycle is high, the economy is bubbling and full of energy, and everyone gets a bit heady and carried away with themselves. And when it's low, everyone's in absolute abject fear and panic. What can we do to stimulate the economy? We've got people out of work and everything's an absolute disaster. And you'll see what happened in COVID is this economic cycle just went south. And in fact, this was the worst I've ever seen this measure get, and I've never seen it move so quickly. And we can track this measure back to World War II. Absolutely frightening. And I thought the previous one was bad, which was the financial crash. There's always another bad. There's always another bottom to reach. And the other thing that's fascinating is just how fast it accelerated up. Global governments were like, COVID's a problem. We've got to really throw everything at this to get the economies restarted. And the economies didn't just grow, they accelerated not just back to where they were just before the crisis, but beyond it, just by a little amount. And one thing I was saying to Matthew is, I don't know what's going to cause the economy to crash. I almost don't need to know what's going to be a source of a problem. But what I can tell you is that whenever the economy is at the top of the cycle, something will bring it down. I'm not clever enough to tell you exactly what it is, but all I can tell you is that we're in a very, very vulnerable position. And we can see it with the dot-com bubble bursting. You can see this wave got very high. You can see it with the financial crisis. Everyone's just getting carried away with themselves. And look, we've now got two things over here. In fact, I was saying to economists, I don't know what's going to cause the economy to blow, but I bet you we're going to have a massive crisis in 2020. I didn't know it was going to be COVID, but actually it could have been anything, quite frankly. And that pulled us down. And here we are again. And we've had another problem, which is everything's getting very heated and the economy is running hot. We can see that natural gas, this is the price of natural gas over the last couple of years. We can see it's sort of risen from, you may not be able to see, from about 100. This is like its index value. And it's gone up massively to about, I can't see with my glasses, so you definitely can't see it. 340 at the top of the chart. So that's 3.5 times increase in natural gas prices, which is eye-watering. If we look at wheat, it's gone from 100 up massively to about 2.5 times. And this is job vacancies in the UK. So is this Brexit? Actually, it's not actually Brexit. It's a phenomenon that's happening throughout Europe, is that there's lots of jobs and not enough people to fill them. So here's a question for you. Under standard economic theory, they draw two lines, a downward line, which is demand, and an upward line, which is supply. Now, if the markets are all in balance, there'll be a crossing point, which is the price at which goods are traded. Now, what's happened is that there's been a supply crunch. Everything in the world is in short supply. So what's happened is this upward-facing supply line has actually moved to the left, and that's led to prices going up. It's not rocket science. This is economic theory that was first sketched out by Adam Smith in Scotland hundreds of years ago. So what's the worst thing you could possibly do? What's the most stupid thing you could do? I know, let's try and stimulate demand. So the Liz Truss budget with Kwasi Kwarteng was the most insane thing I've ever seen. They're just going to make the problem worse because they're assuming that you can grow your way out of a recession, out of a crisis, just growth, go for growth. It doesn't matter. Growth will make all our problems go away. Well, if your economy is overheating and you can't get enough supply, pouring petrol onto the fire is just going to make it worse. And it was insane. Now we've had a change in Chancellor and Prime Minister. They're doing something really sensible. They're saying, do you know what, we're going to calm the economy down. We're going to just temper demand by increasing interest rates, pay back our debt, and everyone just calm down. And that the markets are responding very positively to this. And frankly, it's a relief that we've got grown-ups back in power. I don't know if any of you are following the news, but I mean, it really is a relief that we got grown-ups because we need proper leadership for the country at this time. Something that's a big impact on the cost of living is exchange rates, and particularly the difference in the pound and the dollar. Now, if you're in the city, you'll waft around words such as cable, because people used to telegraph between New York and London to set the price of sterling against dollar. Now, there's a very strong correlation between balance of payments, like what's the trade of the UK against the trade of the US. And when they get out of sync, you tend to see the exchange rate move with it. And in fact, here I'm showing a chart showing the trade balance between the UK and the US, and also the movement of the pound in grey behind it. And you can see that the pound has been essentially devaluing against the dollar. And you'll see something else that's happened right at the very end. You can see the pound going, boo. This isn't great. And one of the reasons this has been driven is because of oil, because we get most of our oil from Norway. Well, the other big supply is actually the United States. And you can get runaway effects from this as well. So when you're buying goods from America, you need someone to swap your sterling for pounds. And someone you're trading with will go, hey, I'm not interested in sterling. I need a better deal. And suddenly everything gets more and more expensive and the problem can spiral. So there is this issue around currency at the moment. There are other factors, but that's the broad thing. So what's happening with this trade war with Trump and China, and how's it affecting the cost of living today? Well, Trump's idea was, I'm going to introduce tariffs into our relationship with China, and I'm going to try and move trade away from China. And in fact, he produces these sheets of goods which would have tariffs on. And there is this sheet called Lists 3. And on this sheet of paper, you'll find fish, you'll find chemicals, you'll find furniture, you'll find electronic goods like mobile phones and chips. And what Trump did is he said, if we're going to import these things from China, we're going to make them 25% more expensive. Now, his thinking was, surely that's going to move demand back to the USA, and we'll have factories in the USA producing these goods. That's actually not what happened at all. And that was frankly naive. What happened was China said, okay, we're not going to produce those things, and we're going to move our workforce to produce the things that aren't sanctioned. And in fact, the Chinese are now producing more of everything that isn't on these lists, which completely, it's grown beyond what their trade was before. But we can see definitely the things that are on the list, they're not being bought by America from China. They're being bought from Taiwan. They're being bought from Mexico and from Vietnam. But if you're trying to buy a washing machine or a car, you may think, hang on, this chip is now being made in America or Taiwan or Vietnam. And the answer is no, it's not. A lot of manufacturers just said, I can't persuade these chip makers to make these chips that they were making in China. They're just not interested. So what a lot of manufacturers have done is they've just ditched the products that they're previously making because they can't get the chips they need to make them. And this is what happens with sanctions and trade tariffs. Trade goes down, and this is what's happening. Trade is going down purely because these tariffs are in place, and the losers are the consumers in America. And it's not actually being that helpful, and it hasn't achieved the desired outcome. The other thing that's been a bit of a disaster is we're seeing the impacts of climate change. And China had the hottest record-breaking temperatures on record this year. It was so hot that in the summer, a lot of Chinese factories just shut down. They said, we'll come back when it's cooler. It's actually too hot for us to produce anything. And China being one of the world's biggest suppliers, this has really kicked us in the pants. This is the impact of climate change. I'm going to talk about food. So this picture is the inside of a Dutch growing horticultural vine house. Do you know who taught the Dutch how to grow? Us. Absolutely. In fact, my granddad told me that he had some Dutch growers arrive in Guernsey after the war, and they wanted to find out how we grew things under glass. And of course, we said, this is what you need to do. This is how you go about it. And the Dutch decided to adopt growing as their their national objective. And the governments in Holland have literally just thrown money after growing. And in fact, it's one of the biggest suppliers to the UK, and Europe is actually Holland. So things that power horticulture and food is obviously fertilizers. So where do these fertilizers come from? To be a manufacturer of fertilizer, you need a very cheap supply of energy. So if you're an oil producing country, it's quite easy for you to make fertilizer and then export it. And we can see Russia's on there, and we can see China's on there. So what's happened over the course of the year? Well, Russia's gone to war with Ukraine. That means there's now a whole bunch of trade restrictions on buying fertilizer from Russia. And the trade war is going on with China, and China's actually restricted exports of fertilizer. And you can see that's pretty much most of the production of fertilizer. And this hasn't been felt yet. This is going to affect us next year. So that's not great. And it gets worse. There's also potash, which is used, as well as pure fertilizer, nitrogen-based fertilizer. And that's mainly come from Belarus. And now sanctions have come in to hit Belarus. And China's got this export ban on phosphate fertilizer, and forget Russia as a supplier of fertilizer. Trade sanctions will not permit fertilizer to come into Europe. 46% of our food is imported, and the biggest importer of food is the Netherlands. And then we've got Germany, Ireland, and France in that order. Now, these countries are reporting, and in fact, Irish Agriculture and Food Development Authority is saying, looking at our production of, mainly things like tomatoes, for example, costs have grown between 13% and 49%. And the gas prices have really kicked these horticultural businesses in the pants, because a lot of these vine houses are heated by gas. And if you've got gas prices going up the roof, if you've got fertilizer going up the roof, I'm afraid food's going to get really, really expensive. And so all these countries are reporting massive increase in production costs for food. This is a snapshot of wheat exporters. Now, there's two countries that aren't on this little chart. You'll see the US is the biggest exporter of wheat, followed by Russia and Ukraine. They're not the biggest producers of wheat. The biggest producers of wheat are actually India and China. Now, China eat pretty much all their own wheat, and India pretty much eats all of its own wheat. But there are things that will affect the prices of wheat in the UK. Now, the UK actually produces most of its wheat and eats most of its wheat. But if the prices are going up in these countries, like Egypt, for example, it also affects prices in the UK. So the price of wheat has been going up because of the Russia and Ukraine war, and also the costs of fertilizer. Something big happened in India. India also had a massive heat wave, and production of wheat in India took a massive kick in the pants. So India was having to import wheat where previously it grew and ate all of its own wheat. So this has been a big problem. Again, this is climate related. And the US did not escape climate change either. Over the course of this year, the Mississippi dried up. And normally in the Mississippi, you have huge, enormous barges of grain just trickling down the Mississippi River. And of course, prices of shipping wheat just rose 2,000% over the course of the summer. Now, this is not caused by oil prices. This is caused by climate change. And it's real, and it affects the price of your cornflakes. It's not the only area where there's been climate impact on our food production. We can see, for example, in peppers, on the top left, they've taken a kick in the pants. Mustard production's fallen off a cliff, and that's because of extreme weather. In the US, frosts have pretty much decimated the apple crop. Coffee in Brazil, we've got wheat, drought, heat wave, and armed conflict. And interestingly, grapes. Now, grape production in America took a hit, and it took a hit because of high temperatures in California and wildfires, all caused by climate change. Now, anyone who's watching the news this year would have seen in the south of France, record temperatures in the south of France and fires throughout Bordeaux. And there was a very real risk that those fires could have spread actually into the vineyards. And we were very close to having almost a major shutdown of the French wine production in the south of France. And it's only going to take temperatures to go up a tiny, tiny, tiny bit to turn that tinder up to the next level of flammability. So we're actually on a bit of a knife edge. So 46% of the food in the UK comes from the UK. 46% is imported, and 54% is grown in the UK. And in the UK, this year, we've actually had quite good wheat production, but it wasn't the case last year. Last year, we had extreme weather events, which affected the production of wheat by about 17%. And we also had on oil, rapeseed, we had lots of what you might call biosecurity events, and this is disease, both insects and biological attacking plants. And the change in the weather is making it much easier for pathogens to hit crop production. And the other thing which was a surprise to me was the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs in the UK was saying soil degradation is now a problem. It's costing the UK about £1.2 billion a year because we're losing the quality of our topsoil, because farmers aren't using regenerative farming techniques to keep their soil healthy and their soil alive. And this is a big problem. We need to change how we're managing our earth and our soil so that it's good for the next couple of hundred years. And unfortunately, just taking what you can out of the soil has a long-term impact. I'm interested to ask Matthew Aguala about that later. And weather's hitting the UK. Now, at the moment, the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs is saying we might have heat stress events in the UK over the next 10 years, which will hit cattle, sheep, pigs. And you need to start preparing for it. Now, again, I wasn't expecting this to happen now. I thought this would all happen in the never, never, but it is happening now. So what can we do about it? Here's a straight banana. Here's some wonky raspberries. Why am I showing this slide? Well, huge amounts of food are wasted every year. A good way to sort out some of our supply problems is to consume all the food that we buy. It's a really simple thing to ask. But if we all do it, there'll be much more to go around and prices will come down. Please don't waste food. It's as simple as that. And try and eat wonky vegetables, because supermarkets are so used to providing apples which are of a very specific shape, bananas that are curved, and huge amounts of waste happen at the farm gate, where they just throw food away because it's not suitable for the supermarkets. And so what can we as consumers do? We can encourage supermarkets to produce wonky food by buying it. So about 79% of our food is consumed. About 17% of it just goes in a dustbin. Wouldn't it be great if we could increase food supply by 17%? It would have a dramatic effect on prices. So let's just stop wasting food. Fuel and light. This is a big thing for Guernsey. It's also a big thing for other parts of the world, particularly Germany. So on November the 15th, Germany finished this is brand new, finished a floating platform to receive liquefied natural gas. So Germany's intention is to switch off all production, all supplies of gas from Russia. And what Germany is saying is, you've got, the outrage to use us as a political pawn in your game with Ukraine, and we're just not having it. Do you know what? This is the end of Germany's relationship for buying gas from America, from Russia. And I don't think Russia will ever really recover its exports of gas with Europe. And they've put so much effort into their supplies for this winter that I think we're going to see a big shift over the winter and into next year around gas prices coming down. And it's because the monumental investment into floating gas terminals like this one. Germany's working very, very hard. Here in the UK, we make about 50% of our gas by pulling it out the North Sea. But for the rest of it, most of our gas actually comes from Norway, and the bit that's left over in the main comes from the USA. But what surprised me was we've not actually got that much. Every couple of years, someone goes, we're running out of gas, and someone says, no, we're not. We've just found some more. But actually, the rate of discovery of gas in the North Sea is dwindling off. In fact, last year they discovered a new gas field. People were letting off party poppers. We got gas, but actually there was only enough there to keep the UK going for a day and a half. So how long is it going to last? If we used all of UK gas every year, it'll last 3 years. So our imports of gas in the UK are going to go up, and that's going to hammer our balance of payments with the US and the dollar, and the pound will go down. This is actually a major national security problem for the UK, is that having to import fuel is going to change our balance of payments, and it's going to change our currency. And whatever we import is going to cost a whole lot more. So we've got to do something. Perhaps we could start fracking. Fracking is an option. However, it's going to take time to frack, and it's going to be expensive. And also, it's not really going to help, because it's not going to help with our food security if we're still pulling gas out the ground and putting it into the atmosphere. What is a really good idea, on the other hand, is to recognise that currently wind energy is cheaper than fossil fuels. And the UK has been piling money, and there's lots of funds, some of whom we support here in Guernsey, who've been investing in wind turbines in the North Sea. And it is terrific. This year, wind energy has taken over at various points, because this is showing a year-by-year analysis. If I showed you the last couple of months, you can see that wind production of electricity is actually now overpowering fossil fuels. And this is one of the most exciting things that gives me hope for the future. We're replacing the North Sea oil with North Sea wind. And actually, we're not just doing it by a little bit, we are piling resource into it. So here you can see, for example, we're looking at about 8 gigawatts being generated, but actually there's about 12 gigawatts of capacity in the North Sea. They're going to extend that to 50 gigawatts by 2030. But actually, they've got about 130 gigawatts of wind energy production currently being planned, invested in, and being built. So this is going to completely transform the UK as an energy importer to being an energy exporter, and it's completely renewable. So this is really good news. And actually, we need to, and this will be cheaper than fracking. It'll be cheaper than fossil fuels, and it's going to make our contribution to bringing down carbon emissions. So what can we do in Guernsey? We obviously have a very stable nuclear supply of electricity from France, but a lot of us are still getting hammered by the price of kerosene and the prices of gas and petrol. So what we can all do is, some people can afford to get heat pumps, not everyone. Now, here's an interesting heat pump. It's very small. And what it does is it takes the air and it compresses it, which creates heat, and then it puts that heat into your water tank. What's unusual is they've now started making small heat pumps. You can take a boiler in a cupboard and you can replace it with this heat pump. And it'll have two inlets, have an inlet and an outlet, pulling air in from outside and pushing cold air out. And it'll extract all the heat it can from the air. But these are so small that it's very easy to replace your household boiler with it. This is a massive innovation. And it will transform many houses in Guernsey if we can encourage the take-up of these integrated heat pumps, because you won't need all-fired boilers. But in Guernsey, we don't need everyone to go green. Infrastructure for oil is expensive. You need to maintain ships, you need to maintain gas storage facilities. And actually, if any proportion of the population moved away from needing gas, oil, the cost of actually the infrastructure then becomes overwhelming. So we will hit a tipping point in Guernsey, and it may be sooner than we think, when actually everyone will suddenly have to go green and change their buying habits of buying fossil fuels. And it won't be a nice, relaxed, gentle move from one thing to the other. History shows us that actually change happens in very sharp inflection points. And I don't know exactly when it's going to happen. We haven't modeled it, but I'm pretty sure it will happen. And that will have an inflection point in fossil fuels in Guernsey, where it just becomes too expensive because sufficient numbers of the population have moved to green energy. Housing. This is a chart in the UK. What it's showing is that if you're 25 to 34, you can't afford to buy a house, and you don't own a house, and it's getting worse. and that proportion of young people in the community just can't get access to housing. And it's true in Guernsey as well. This is the look at local market house prices in Guernsey. You can see it's just rocketing up and up and up. And this is because the older generations have got cash to spend on housing, and they're bidding the younger populations out from the ability to buy houses. So young people can't afford to buy a house because they've been outbid by the elder generation. And this is looking at rental prices. You can see that the average rental price in Guernsey is, well, it hit £1,800 a month. So if you've just come out of university, you come back to Guernsey, can you actually afford to live here? Of course you can't. It's actually more expensive than the average rental property in London. And actually our median salary isn't the same as median salaries in London. So actually this points to a failure of Guernsey to actually properly govern its property market. We've been far too reactive, we've been far too slow, and we're waiting for stuff to happen. We have to be on the front foot. There's technical factors like the number of households, the household makeup, and it's really important in the community you've got demographic balance. And if all the young people are leaving Guernsey, we're basically stuffed. So we've got to look really closely at our housing proposition, not just the supply. There is this question of how high are our properties in Guernsey. You know, we're obsessed with having if you like, a detached house on a clos in Guernsey. And in fact, the houses are getting smaller and smaller. The gardens are getting almost completely meaningless because they're so small. But we need to rethink our housing proposition. You know, lots of people will be quite happy in flats, and we've got to build up. We'll have to build up. And the other thing we've got to do is we've got to put green lungs back into the island. We've got to start actually reversing the ribbon development by actually getting rid of houses and giving it back to nature, putting the green lungs back into Guernsey. So this is a map of Guernsey's domestic property units. We can see there's areas of density, but we've got to make those dense areas denser. And where houses are scattered around the green parts of Guernsey, if it's not valuable housing, we probably need to give it back to nature. It's all about looking after nature, and we absolutely have to do our bit. It affects soil quality, it affects water quality, the air we breathe, and we can see it in the cost of living that we've been ignoring it for too long. And my last point was we need to work on productivity in the island. We've got to make more from a smaller workforce. And the best way to do it is to work closer with Jersey. And some of you will know my views on ways we can go about that, but thank you. Can I ask Matthew just to share his thoughts on what we said? So, yeah, you've got a microphone.
Certainly, wonderful. Could we start by giving Martyn a hand? It's an excellent thought. And I apologize, I was just frantically searching through my emails to see if I could pull up one of my productivity slides of a talk that I gave just a week or so ago at Oxford. There's an awful lot of overlap between the way that you're presenting things and the way that we're thinking about them at Cambridge and at Yale. I think you're absolutely spot on that the price crunches that we're facing now, some of them have very acute immediate causes, right? So what's going on in Ukraine, COVID lockdowns in China, but it's not just these immediate things over which we have no control. There are other sort of diplomatic, political, and long-term economic trends that are exacerbating these. And essentially what has happened is the things that we do have control over have left us with less space and capacity to deal with the things we can't control. So what are these? Well, the key one, I think, is a lack of investment that would generate enhancements in labor productivity and total factor productivity. Now, I'm going to speak about UK-wide statistics, if that's okay. The United Kingdom invests about 17% of its GDP into fixed capital formation. So we invest 70% into capital. That's not anywhere near enough. If we take a look at the European Union average, it's about 24%. The United States, low to mid 20s. Canada, low to mid 20s. We are way behind on capital investment. Now, why does this matter? Let's try a specific concrete example. If you take a farm worker from India who is working with a shovel and a rake, and you bring them to a farm in the United States, and you give them a tractor, that individual has not changed at all. They're not working any harder. They're not endowed with any better skills, and yet their output per hour has skyrocketed. It's not the individuals. Productivity isn't about whether people are lazy or not. It's about the capital that they have access to get the most out of the time that they invest. And that's a major drawdown. Long-term productivity growth in a country like the UK, the United States, Canada, most of Western Europe should be around 2%. That's what it's been for the past century. But since the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which you pointed out as a tipping point, it has essentially flatlined in the UK. In fact, the statistic of the decade from 2009 to 2019 was that labor productivity growth rate was only 0.3%, down from 2%. These are small numbers, yes, 2%, 0.3%. I'm not talking about very much, except that when you factor that in and play it out over 20 years, we're looking at about a 25% shortfall in GDP, simply from changing our productivity growth from 2% to 0.3%, a 25% shortfall in output. That's a massive loss. So productivity, labor productivity is going to be hugely important. I think that I liked your discussion of food prices and the risks that we face, because you bring in the natural capital side, you bring in the politics side. So the natural capital side being the soil quality. If we destroy our soils, then we are more dependent on the bought-in fertilizers. And when we have an energy price crisis and a fertilizer crisis, which in this instance are combined, but could be independent, right now they're combined, then we are all the more exposed to those risks. That's hugely important. But the other concern that I wanted to bring on this is about the political capital that we need to think about. We have seen in the past, when we see food price spikes, when we see drops in the wheat production, that what governments tend to do is impose export bans. So we nearly faced this year after the exports of grain from Ukraine and Russia collapsed. We nearly saw Egypt impose export bans, China imposing export bans. They didn't. In 2017, these countries did. And what that does is it locks up all trade in these agricultural commodities. And that creates shortages where none actually exist. So we need to keep those trade links open. But that requires a political and diplomatic capacity and integrity that I'm not sure we still have in the world today. And so this is, I think, a hugely important concern for us. And the final thing on food waste, I'm going to be a bit difficult here. So we waste a lot of our food. The only way that we can do that is because it's cheap. If food was very expensive, we wouldn't waste as much. We know this because when we look at energy prices in the UK, the energy demand in the UK in October was about 37% less than the energy demand in last year's October. What's happened? We're still in the same houses. It was a bit warmer, but we're afraid of the energy prices. And so people are really reducing their demand. High prices, reduce demand, reduce the waste. The problem is, if we start eating all of the food that we purchase at home, which we should do for environmental reasons, we will throw out less food. This will reduce the food prices. As the food prices fall, so too does the incentive to make sure we're consuming every last bite. So you get this sort of demand destruction and demand construction on the price increases and price decreases. So the amount of waste is related to the price. And so I think that's going to be a concern. And the final thing, because I don't know how long I was meant to speak, the final thing that I would like to point out is that we've seen really high increases in energy prices, and that's driven up inflation. But if that levels out, even at a high level, then the next source of inflation might not be energy prices. Once you stick at a high level, it's no longer inflating, it's no longer increasing prices. So what's next? And I think it might well be food, because of the fertilizer prices going up. That means that farmers who would normally have to purchase a year in advance for their fertilizer inputs have tried to shift away. They're downscaling their expectations of production. And so we'll see the next shortage in food production. And that's where I think inflation will come in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Matthew. That's terrific. Thank you. We'll be having lunch very, very shortly, but can I invite sort of 5 minutes, 7 minutes of questions? Everyone's too shy. Yeah, thanks.
Hi there. Just on the point of inflation on the next 3 or 4 year views, 3 or 4 year view versus 10 years, there'll be a readjustment of relative real prices. And to some extent, would you see the inflation as part of the cure rather than the problem, to the extent that it shifts demand and consumption patterns?
That's a beautiful point, and that actually ties in with Matthew's point that actually prices will surf to find a level. I mean, Rupert often describes the markets as water finding a level. Clearly, there will be some rebalancing. Prices going up will reduce demand. That's part of the cure, absolutely. There is this problem about the haves and the have-nots. And my worry is that we'll see more social polarization. And we're going to have to figure out how to protect the vulnerable. There are some people, for example, who they might have an ill patient at home and their electricity consumption is just off the roof. If they're suddenly looking at 1,000% increase in bills, that's going to create real problems for people in need. So inflation in itself is definitely, the market's finding a level, but we also need to make sure that we navigate the future protecting the vulnerable, which is why I think in society, people have different levels of purchasing power. If those who have got the money to move on to alternative sources of energy, for example, we really need them to start making purchasing decisions now. It's really, we need to move forwards. Sasha, I'll come to you in a minute.
Thanks, Laura. Martyn, you've given an excellent macroeconomic view and how little places like Guernsey are at the whim of often forces which are beyond us. But what do you think will be the specific issues facing Guernsey, that whether we failed or perhaps there are constraints such as land availability that you think make our situation worse, or perhaps have been failures so far? Thank you.
So trust. We need to have a more trusting relationship with government. Our deputies need to have more trusting relationships with each other. And everyone's falling into these little silos where they're not sharing ideas, they're not strategically approaching problems, it's just fractured. And I think there's been, from my observations, a failure in government to govern. I want to see much more integrated approach. There's too many people who hate Jersey, which doesn't make any sense for me at all. We have to be reducing our costs by working with Jersey. Our productivity could really improve if we worked much closer with Jersey. And that's something that Guernsey, we really failed to do. And some of you will find that massively controversial. And my message to you is you need to change your mind. You need to think differently about it. We've got to work better with Jersey. But the other thing is to solve, for example, the housing crisis is going to involve working much closer with the private sector. And the private sector needs to fund and deliver and housing solutions. And the housing solutions need to be able to wash their face by paying for themselves to encourage more investment. We've not developed a really good relationship with the private sector for large investment into the island. Our capital investment, Matthew was talking about capital investment earlier. Our capital investment in Guernsey into our infrastructure has been close to zero. We don't even have a person in Guernsey whose job it is to think about infrastructure investment. And I hope that the development corporation or whatever it's morphing into will have the wisdom to operate almost as a sort of separate entity from government and to establish a really good relationship with funding bodies and an excellent relationship with the consumers and the people of Guernsey to deliver what Guernsey wants. Sorry.
2 points. Amazing economic analysis. But I would, and you've just mentioned the Guernsey growth point, but I would say the problem with a lot of the thinking we've heard is that it goes against political grandstanding, because the politicians get votes by grandstanding, which means playing into the mindsets of people in the media and in the wider community. And that is an issue. And I liked, well, I kind of like Liz Truss and Quasi in a funny sort of way, even though it was bats at the time they did it, etc. But I would argue, I might do an article on this myself, that ever since 2007, when Guernsey went down the 0-10 route, we have, in a weird kind of way, had our own long-term quasi-Liz Truss government, where we haven't invested in infrastructure, where we haven't invested in housing, but we've been following an ambitious supply-side, really low-tax economy as our main selling point. And I think moving out of that model to look at the big infrastructural questions, which you, Martyn, have been actually pushing for many years, it's something we need to do, but it's difficult in our system, to say the least.
John, thank you. That's been a really good insight. Thank you. Any more? Yes, thank you. Sorry, can you say your name at the beginning?
Jenny Benjamin.
Thank you, Jenny.
I'm interested in what you were saying about the demographics. We've got an aging population, and yet we've still got very ageist policies and work practices. States of Guernsey, for example, probably wouldn't employ people in their 70s, even though they might have many years of economic benefit. So maybe we need to look at that. Also, our health and social care is breaking down, and people are having to look after elderly relatives or disabled relatives without any help. So they have to leave the economic workforce. And also, we don't have a very coordinated childcare policy in the island, so that women, for example, find it difficult to work because of childcare costs.
That's extremely pertinent. It is very hard to raise a family and manage a career, and particularly during, I really sympathise with Laura here. If you've got a young family, it's, you really feel like you're on your own, battling against everything. But what's great about demographics is that older people are getting massively healthy compared to where they were 20 years ago. I met a 75-year-old at the weekend who started skiing at age 50. She was learned to fly a spinnaker on a yacht at age 60. And it's like, you are so rock and roll. We need more of that. And we got to encourage the older demographic to live super active lives and participate in the economy. And actually, there's so many different, they say people have 3 careers in the course of their lives. Now hopefully we're looking at 4. And there's always a different role that someone can play, which will add value to the economy. So it may not be doing what you've previously done, but it will almost certainly be something else that really helps the economy. So I'm totally supportive of your demographic point. In relation to the carers, I'm not a caring expert. And, I had my father in White Bane House for the last few years of his life. And we had carers come in regularly to look after him. But it did take a big effort from us as a family, particularly my wife, Wendy, to actually support, you know, the wider family caring role. And I think there's some expectations that that's someone else's problem to deal with. But I think we need to move our own expectations, that we need to learn how to take responsibility for caring for relatives and friends. And, you know, we've got to learn as a society, just as they do in Hong Kong, to look after each other a bit more than we have. And perhaps it shouldn't fall on the state. Perhaps we have to expect ourselves to be a bit more caring. That's my observation, but I'm not an expert. Right. I know lunch will be wanting to come in at any minute.
Very well. Thanks a lot. Yeah, echoing the others' thoughts on the nuanced and fascinating nature of your presentation, both of you. Guernsey is often insulated from some of these crises. They seem to affect us a little bit less than others. And one area that is a cause of concern, I think, is perhaps that is this energy situation. So we hear about the spiraling energy costs in the UK. You've shown some graphs on those, but we are by and large insulated from that by the deal we have with France and the renewables we buy there, and the hedging that has gone on. But at some stage in the next 18 months, that's going to go away. And so do you think that we're going to have a kind of double bubble of horror when that hedging hits us, and we face whatever the new reality is on energy prices?
So uranium supplies have been more stable than most. The other thing is one of the biggest uranium reserves is actually in Kazakhstan, and there are lots of governments who are now rocking up with briefcases in the stands, trying to figure out how we can get more uranium delivered into the Western European markets to provide a buffer against, you know, sharp rises in uranium. So I can see that people are working on it right now, and I hope that they will be able to deliver deals to insulate us from other input costs. So it is a risk. We've just got to hope that everyone puts their best foot forward and learns from what's happened over the last 2 years. I mean, for example, after the last fuel crisis, France said, you know what, we're done with the whole petrol thing. We're going to go nuclear. And the whole of France invested massively in nuclear energy. In the UK, we didn't. But the great news is the UK is really moving ahead on the wind supply. I feel so good. I really feel great about our efforts on wind. And I think it's happening very, very, very quickly. The young generation are so active in building the future of our energy networks and our food networks. I'm actually really proud of what I've seen in the younger generations in the UK. And you know, they've got an exciting future ahead of them, and it's all this exciting change. You know, I wish all you guys a lot of luck on your future journeys. It's a very exciting time to be entering industry. Yeah, thank you.
A big thank you to Martyn for today, and for the very fortunate contribution we've had from Matthew as well. I think almost without fail at the end of these lunches, we come to the understanding that it's going to take working together to achieve anything. And I think there's going to be some very pertinent takeaways for everyone who's been here today. We've also been recording it, so we'll be putting this up on the Chamber channels on YouTube. So please do share what you've been talking about today, and keep these conversations going. And yeah, just a big thank you. We've got the next OGH lunch actually next Monday. And unusually, we've got Lieutenant Governor again talking about good leadership needed. He's got a lot to say on that. So please do come along next Monday. And then on the 15th of December, we've got our own leader, President Diane Degare, talking to us about Chamber's future. So thank you, everybody, and enormous thank you to Martyn once again.